Minasama, konnichiwa. Watashi wa America, California, Shu no Kenjiho no Amanda Griffith tomoshimasu. It is such an honor to be given the privilege of speaking with you today. I've been a prosecutor for 20 years and have represented victims in proceedings in state and federal court. For the last 18 years, my career has been spent prosecuting crimes against children, including physical and sexual abuse, child exploitation crimes, and child homicide. Crimes against children strike at the soul of society and cause immeasurable harm to the child victims. Those who prey on the children count on their age and their youth to silence and shame them from disclosing so they can move on to the next victim undetected. Or they use their position in the child victim's life to threaten harm for speaking out about the abuse. Our judicial system is not perfect, but we do take steps to try to preserve the dignity and privacy of our victims while obtaining justice for the abuse that they have suffered. The laws in the United States at the federal level and for each of the 50 states have evolved over the years because of the unique challenges that arise in investigating and prosecuting these horrible crimes. 40 years ago, if a child had disclosed they had been sexually assaulted, they were taken to a police station and asked to repeat the disclosure again in a formal and often intimidating environment. They sometimes had to tell their story of abuse over and over to various law enforcement agents and prosecutors. The trauma for the victim was real. Repeatedly telling their story just reinforced the trauma they had already experienced. Some law enforcement agents and prosecutors did not have training in working with children and how to handle the developmental issues related to their age and vocabulary. This resulted in confusion, misunderstandings, or an incomplete understanding of the nature of abuse that furthered the trauma. Now, with the assistance of children's advocacy centers, when victims disclose abuse, they can be interviewed by forensic interviewers in a location away from the police station. Children's advocacy centers are less sterile than police stations, designed and decorated in a way to provide comfort in the same way one would have when going into a home. The forensic interviewer has been specially trained in how to conduct interviews with victims and usually has a background that includes education and training in child development and social work. The interview is also recorded, which minimizes the number of times the victim has to talk about the abuse. The law enforcement officers and prosecutors can review the video as needed as the investigation progresses. Additionally, in almost every instance, the investigating law enforcement officer can watch the interview from a separate room as it is being conducted to understand the scope and the nature of the abuse. The forensic interviewer, at an appropriate time, can step out of the interview room and confer with the officer to see if there are follow-up questions that need to be asked to help the investigation. The ability to get this information during the forensic interview can assist law enforcement in collecting evidence to corroborate the child victim's disclosure. The benefits of children's advocacy centers goes just beyond the use of the forensic interview process. Sometimes the victims need medical evaluations and treatment. Many of the children's advocacy centers have space for medical treatment rooms for examinations. Child victims can be seen by a medical professional without needing to go to a separate hospital. Beyond the criminal justice system, victims and their families often need therapy or other assistance to deal with the trauma and the effects of the abuse. Children's advocacy centers provide therapy for victims and their families, sometimes well beyond the conclusion of the criminal case. This level of cooperation among law enforcement agents, prosecutors, and non-governmental organizations is unique but integral to how we investigate and prosecute crimes against children. Across the United States, crimes against children are taken seriously and are usually investigated and prosecuted by experienced law enforcement officers and prosecutors. In many jurisdictions, the law enforcement officers and prosecutors assigned to these cases share space at the children's advocacy centers. Using this multidisciplinary team approach and having all of the interested stakeholders in one location increases the effectiveness of the investigation because information is shared more quickly and efficiently, which assists in bringing potential charges sooner. While a large number of prosecutions resolve with plea agreements, the defendant has the right to demand a trial. Special laws have been passed in the vast majority of jurisdictions that are unique to child exploitation crimes to address the types of evidence that can be admitted in court during a trial. In the American criminal justice system, there is a preference not to rely on hearsay statements in court. That means a witness testifying about something another person said, though there are very limited exceptions where there is not a reason to doubt the truthfulness of the non-testifying person. This rule is less strict in child sexual assault cases. There, in most of the states, the first person the child victim told about the abuse can come into court and testify about what the child victim reported. Many times, the most complete disclosure about the abuse comes from the forensic interview. This means the forensic interviewer can be called to testify about the interview, and oftentimes, the forensic interview can be played during the trial. The rule against hearsay also usually does not apply to statements made to doctors and other medical professionals, as there is a belief that people will be honest with the medical professionals so they can get appropriate care and treatment. Child victims who are seen by a medical professional regarding physical or sexual abuse will often disclose how they were abused. In a trial, the medical professional can be called as a witness to testify about what the child victim reported. They can also testify about medical findings that can corroborate what the child victim has reported. In addition to the rules of evidence that deal with child victims, there are some rules that apply to defendants who have committed child exploitation crimes. In our criminal justice system, we do not usually rely on propensity evidence to establish that a defendant committed the current crime just because he has committed the same crime in the past. Sadly, in many child exploitation cases, the defendants charged have harmed other children before the current allegations. In this situation, prosecutors can present evidence of the prior acts of abuse to prove the defendant committed the crime they are currently accused of. These are just 3 examples of how specialized rules for child exploitation and abuse cases are used to support the prosecution. The proliferation of technology and the internet has resulted in new ways for individuals to exploit and abuse children. Child victims do not have to be in the same physical location as the person that harms them, as their cellular phone or tablet allows the child victim to make contact with individuals across town, across the country, or around the world. Regrettably, it is becoming more common for individuals to record the exploitation and to share the images and videos with others who may share a common interest. While the creation of these images and videos is direct evidence of the exploitation, it is also a permanent recording of the abuse of the child victim. And once it's disseminated on the internet, it is there forever and will forever traumatize the victim. Recognizing this, there are special statutes that allow law enforcement to obtain these images and videos from email providers, internet service providers, and social media companies. These companies are also required, if this material is discovered on their platforms, to report their existence and provide information about the account holders. Some child victims are embarrassed or ashamed of what is happening to them, or sometimes they've been threatened to not disclose the exploitation or abuse, but these companies can assist in the detection of this material, which begins the investigative process. Protecting the privacy interest of the child victim is also important. In our system, the defendant has a constitutional right to confront the individuals who have accused him of a crime. However, in cases involving sexual assault or crimes against children, prosecutors can take steps to protect the identity of the victims from being exposed to the public. In court documents, victims can be referred to by their initials or by a pseudonym. Prosecutors can obtain protective orders from the court to limit who gets access to the investigative material. These privacy protections also encourage other victims to come forward. The severity of the potential punishments reflects the importance of holding the offenders accountable in our criminal justice system. If convicted of child exploitation crimes, there are significant custodial sanctions that can be imposed, including mandatory minimum sentences or up to lifetime imprisonment in some cases. In addition to the custodial punishment, defendants convicted of child exploitation crimes can be monitored by the courts for several years or even for the rest of their lives. While being supervised, defendants are required to comply with a number of restrictions and conditions, including location monitoring and curfews, no access to minors without supervision, restrictions on where defendants can live to keep them away from schools and parks or places where children frequent, and if the crime involved the use of computers, defendants can have limited access to computers and the internet, and any devices they do own are subject to being monitored. Lastly, defendants are often required to register in a public database of convicted sex offenders so that members of the public are aware of the conviction. This requirement can exist for the defendant's entire life. These consequences balance the need to punish defendants for the harm they have inflicted, obtain justice for the victims, protect the public, and provide deterrence for others with similar criminal tendencies. Nelson Mandela has said, "There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than in the way in which it treats its children." This quote exemplifies the mission we have as prosecutors in investigating and prosecuting the people who harm and abuse our children. There is no perfect legal system that can address the challenges and the difficulties in investigating and prosecuting child exploitation crimes. but the laws and rules of evidence used by law enforcement agents and prosecutors in the United States effectively balance the presumption of innocence and constitutional rights of defendants accused of crimes with the need to protect victims and aggressively investigate these heinous crimes. 本日はビデオメッセージを聞いてくださり、本当にありがとうございます。